Our last burn of the spring season this year was March 18th, I believe. Um, our spring burn season typically runs into May. So essentially, um, we were just getting started this spring when the whole coronavirus foolishness shut everything down. And it was the agencies ultimately that pulled the plug one by one on the season. As practitioners, um, we would have kept on going. That we were, some of us were trying to figure out workarounds and protocols to be able to keep going. But ultimately, the agencies uh, pulled the plug. Um, some sooner than others, but ultimately all of them just capped the activities. Now, there's been 2 or 3 burns completed since then. This is, when I'm recording this, mid-November. So basically, over the last 8 months, there's maybe been like I said, 2 or 3 burns that I know of: a site prep burn, a marsh burn, which we can typically do in the wintertime. But fall burning, we've kind of shelved for ecological reasons more than anything. We've just found that for a lot of what we're trying to do in this part of the world, that fall burning just isn't effective. Doesn't get us where we want to go. So, um, we're basically waiting now until the next spring burn season. So it may be next March, February or March, realistically, before we start getting cranked up in this part of the world in our prescribed fire seasons again. So, what does that long period of inactivity for folks mean? Now, folks that have a wildfire component to their jobs, people that have dedicated fire positions, primarily like federal land management agencies like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that I used to work for. Some state forestry agencies have wildfire suppression responsibilities. But what about those agencies or those entities that don't have that as part of their job or don't have dedicated fire staff? Those folks may be going an entire year between fire experience or fire activity. This is not something that's even uncommon in the wildfire realm. Places that aren't active in prescribed fire, and there are a lot of them for one reason or another, are folks that by seasonality don't have, they essentially have 6 months off because of the winter season. So even on a wildfire response perspective, there are long gaps in activity. Now, fire refreshers are supposed to compensate for some of that, hence the name, the refresher. But that has even kind of gone by the boards, particularly this year, where we are now, myself and everyone that took the refresher with me back in November of last year, we're now expired on refreshers, technically. I'm sure what the protocol is going to be now is, do stuff online, do it virtually, so to speak. I'm not a fan of that, and even with that, the hours have been continually cut back. It used to be not that long ago, the requirement was, an 8-hour refresher training, and that got reduced back to 4 hours, and what are you getting out of it now? When when it was deemed appropriate or necessary to have 8 hours of refresher training, and now you're doing X amount of hours sitting at a computer, looking at stuff online. Is that the same thing? I have a problem with that. Even now, we're at the point where pack tests, the arduous duty pack test, fitness test was waived this year. Basically, the guidance came out this spring that if you had a valid pack test from last year, from 2019, and nothing had changed, and you were good to go physically, now you didn't have to do one in 2020 again because of the coronavirus stuff. So, folks now are going to be pushing probably 2 years before they've done even a pack test. So I think this is a huge problem, and how do we address that problem? So what about those folks that have the ability, even though we've lost a large part of our prescribed fire season, we may or may not do anything in the fall or winter prescribed fire-wise, but what about those folks that have still had the opportunity to go out on wildfire assignments? We had a very busy western wildfire season this year, still going on in some places. What does a wildfire assignment do for you? Well, it gets you to think about, it gets you working in an ICS environment. It gets you to think about fire behavior. It gets you, up close experience working on a fire line. It gets you thinking about fire. Just that whole mindset of being on a fire, being a part of a fire crew. So all that's valuable experience that doesn't necessarily make up for a whole, breadth of a 3 or 4 month long prescribed fire season, but it's something. And again, we have a lot of folks that aren't in dedicated fire positions, that aren't tasked with fire suppression at all. And so these folks, by and large, aren't thinking about fire at all at this point. Their gear's in a corner. They're doing their regular job. They may be a biologist. They may be a maintenance employee. They may be office staff of one kind or another. They're doing their job, but their job isn't fire. But those folks are still going to be at some point asked to come out on a fire line. And a lot of the same applies to folks that are in leadership positions on fires, burn bosses. Same deal. If you're not in a dedicated fire position, and but you're still your agency's burn boss, how much time and effort are you putting into staying current in those things? So what are some things that we can do? Well, the refreshers obviously are one thing. One thing that I tried a couple years ago in my previous job was to do training days, to set up formal training days. I think I did them once a week or once a month. I forget now what I did. But the idea was that we would take a Monday morning, say, or a Monday afternoon, and just deal specifically with one topic and go in depth in it. For instance, we had one time we had a helicopter manager put a little presentation together, and we went out and built sling loads and went over some relatively basic helicopter things or aviation things that a lot of us don't do on a regular basis because we may be helicopter crew members or whatever, but it's just not something we practice very often. So, things like that we went out and tried to do an afternoon in-depth training on. And what I found was, and I made this training available to all of all the agency staff, all the partner staff. I previewed it to folks, said this is what I'm doing. Here's the schedule. Everyone's welcome to come. Gave them advance notice of when we were doing the days, and basically, for the most part, the only people that showed up for the training were the people that worked for me and basically that I could make show up for the training. Looking back on it, I didn't provide any real incentive for folks to show up. I also didn't think I had to. I thought the incentive itself was being able to, to get some hands-on training, to get refreshed, even though it wasn't a refresher per se. But folks just weren't motivated to show up. So, thinking about doing something like that in the future, I would think about some way of incentivizing it. Now, what that can be, I don't know exactly. I think it's probably going to depend on the agency or the entity. But without that, or without making someone have to show up, and that's essentially why people attend fire refreshers, because it's mandatory. You have to do it, and you get compliance that way. Well, there's only so many people I could in my previous job mandate showing up, but and that's not usually the most effective way to get people to participate. And this has been one of the biggest challenges I found in the latter part of my career, is getting people to participate even in burns, even on the prescribed fire side of things, getting them to come out. And that's one of the reasons I started relying a lot on local partners, because I could always count on some amount of those folks showing up. But those are the folks now that are in that situation where it may be a year in between actual fire experiences for them. I don't want that to reflect negatively on them, but your skills erode, your skills get rusty. Everyone's does if you're not doing something on a regular basis. So that is something that is going to have to be addressed, and not by crossing your fingers and hoping that come next February or next March, when and if we get rolling again on our prescribed fire season, that folks are just going to fall in line and there's not going to be any hiccups along the way, because this is a safety issue to me, far beyond the coronavirus risk that we may encounter for the fire crews themselves. I think you're much more likely to run into accidents and incidents because of rust and inactivity than you're ever going to run into with any ramifications from a pandemic that we can build in some protocols for. Now, I mentioned the fact that we've really gotten away from fall burning for a lot of habitat types. While ecologically, it may not be in the best interests of some folks to do burning at this time of year, or do burning outside the desired season, just strictly for that experience part of it, to get people, to keep people active, to keep people engaged. It may be worth doing, outside of the ecological benefit, strictly for the human benefit. So that's something fire leaders, fire managers should definitely consider.